Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the University this afternoon. My name's Ian Harper and it's my pleasure to chair this afternoon's session on China and the new economy. I would like to acknowledge, to begin with, the alumni of the University. It's wonderful to have you back here at the University this afternoon and supporting the University's Festival of Ideas. I also acknowledge our distinguished guests, amongst whom I see former Vice-Chancellor Professor David Pennington. David, lovely to see you again here this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, if you've been to former sessions, you'll be aware of the routine. If this is your first, then can I point out that these sessions are being filmed and also taped, audio tape. Well, China and the new economic order. What could be more apposite a topic than that? And we have for you this afternoon 3 experts, 1 political scientist and 2 economists to enlighten us about China and the new economic order this afternoon. On my immediate right is Dr. Pradeep Tanager. Pradeep is with the University's School of Politics, or I should say Social and Political Sciences. Pradeep is a political scientist by training. He's also someone who has a deep interest in China and a lot of experience. He's lived in China for many years, and so I understand he's fluent in Mandarin, Pradeep, although I have it on good authority that he's going to speak to us in English this afternoon. On Pradeep's right is Saul Eslake. Saul would be well known to this audience, particularly in this city. Saul is Chief Economist of ANZ Bank, and you would be aware that amongst our major banks, the ANZ arguably has the greatest exposure and interest in Asia. Saul is regularly in China, has a significant interest in the Chinese economy, and in particular, today he'll be talking to us about China and the world economy, how China has been dealing with the GFC and what it might mean for all of us as China responds to the GFC. And then on Saul's right is Associate Professor Mark Crosby. Mark and I have been colleagues for many years when I was, until recently, at the Melbourne Business School. Mark is still at the Melbourne Business School, and Mark is a macroeconomist like myself, but unlike myself, Mark has a special interest in Asia and China. Mark has spent a number of years in different institutions around Asia, most notably the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, and some time also at the National Monetary Authority of Singapore. So Mark is well informed about China. Today he's going to talk to us about China and Australia, the economic relationship between those 2 countries, again, which won't surprise you to hear is very important for us. I'm going to invite our speakers to speak in order, one after the other, and I've asked each to speak to us for 10 minutes, which is a little less time than perhaps others have been used to in the series here at the festival, but I've asked each of them to speak for 10 minutes only so that we have maximum time for interaction with the audience. So do please prepare your questions as you are listening to our speakers. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Pradeep Tanager. Pradeep is going to speak to us to begin with about the growing interrelationship between the business and political elites in modern China. Please welcome Dr. Pradeep Tanager.
Well, we've had some fascinating discussions about China yesterday evening and again this morning, and I hope that you haven't yet exhausted your curiosity about China, and there's still plenty of ideas left and plenty of questions left to ask, and we'll try and answer those questions as well as we can. As Ian said, I have an interest in the relationship between politics and business in China. As somebody teaching in a school of political science, I have an interest in not only just the pure politics of China, but also the economic factors behind that politics. Now, in the past few months, if you've been reading the newspapers in this country, a great deal of newspaper column space has been devoted to the efforts of a state-owned Chinese company to increase its stake in one of Australia's largest mining companies. Naturally, a range of views have been expressed on the merits or otherwise of this proposal, with some for and others against it. Along with some very incisive commentary, we've also seen and heard a lot of emotional arguments, including a television advertisement, which was obviously against this proposal. But what has been missing from this debate is any objective discussion of the relationship between what is happening in China itself and China's ambitions for its role in the rest of the world. So let me briefly look at China or developments in China, and then I'll try and look at China's role or China's desired role in the world. When one looks at China's economic reforms of the past 30 years, it becomes apparent that despite all the economic dynamism of China, the role of the state in the country's economic life has not declined to any significant extent. True, it can no longer be called a centrally planned command economy, but that does not mean that the Chinese state has retreated from managing the economy. Its methods have changed, but not the desire to control the commanding heights of the economy. Now, if you go back and look at the reforms, early reforms of the 1980s, you see a number of features of that particular phase in China's economic development. And quite often, China's reforms are described using Deng Xiaoping's phrase that we cross the river while feeling for the stones under feet. 摸着石头过河. But we've seen that in the 80s, these reforms were experimental. In other words, there was no blueprint to follow. And the Communist Party leadership and the Chinese people were experimenting with what was feasible and what was not. In other words, 2 steps forward, perhaps 1 step backward. And also, another feature of these early reforms was that the focus of the early reforms in the early 1980s, and to some extent even in the second half of the 1980s, that the focus was very much on rural China. And more importantly, these first phase of reforms were accompanied by a more liberal political outlook. It did not mean that China was democratic in the 1980s, but there was much greater tolerance of different views, even encouragement for different views until the events of May-June 1989. But since the events of June 4th, 1989, China has moved into a new phase of economic development. The policy changes beginning in the 1990s, to use Huang Yasheng's words. Huang Yasheng is a leading China scholar who is now based at MIT. And he says that the 1990s reforms were not experimental. In other words, unlike the 1980s reforms, the 1990s reform were not experimental. Rather, they were rooted in a technocratic industrial policy blueprint and a heavy urban bias. So apart from the technocratic nature and urban bias, the economic policies that began to take shape in the early 1990s were designed not with an aim to foster private entrepreneurship, but to entrench state control over the economy and to promote political dependency on the state. What has emerged over the past 2 decades is a system in which the politics and business have become conflated. What Charles Young describes in his posthumously published memoirs as the commercialization of power. This naturally leads to corruption. This form or this close relationship between politics and business naturally leads to corruption and abuse of power, which in turn leads to public anger and loss of faith in the government, which we see in the increasing incidence of the so-called mass incidents or popular protests in China. If you look at the large state-owned sector of the economy, the party control over this sector is still quite strong. While the state has retreated from some sectors of the economy, its policy of grasping the large, letting go of the small, means that it continues to maintain a firm grip on a number of important industrial sectors, despite many institutional changes over the past 30 years. Party supervision in industry is exercised mainly through appointment, performance appraisal, and, quote-unquote, discipline inspection of company cadres. It is not uncommon in China today for officials to move between corporate and bureaucratic positions at the behest of the party leadership. We saw, for example, the person who inked the deal with, or the initial deal with Rio Tinto is now an employee of the State Council or the Chinese cabinet. So the chairman of a major mining company can become a government bureaucrat. The party's right to appoint, transfer, or sack senior corporate executives of state-owned enterprises means that it is able to control their corporate and political behavior to a large extent. Now, what of the private entrepreneurs? While the government does not seek to privatize the whole economy, its control over the economy and its ability to change policy without much debate or no debate at all means that it makes sense for the entrepreneurs to get as close to the party and the government as possible. Ever since the changes to the party constitution early this decade, it is now possible to be bourgeois and communist at the same time. For many new millionaire members of the party, the motivation for joining the party is not ideological sympathy with the party doctrine, that is, assuming that there is a party doctrine now. Rather, it is to get access to the policy and material resources that the party still controls. In addition to joining the party, many entrepreneurs are also actively seeking membership of the people's congresses at the local, provincial, or national levels. Alternatively, they seek to become members of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, or CPPCC, which is a consultative body which meets in parallel with the People's Congress but lacks its legislative powers. So, why does the party want entrepreneurs to join the party? I mean, in other words, why does it encourage the new capitalists to become members of the Chinese Communist Party? The answer has to be co-option. In other words, the party is keen to co-opt all social forces that could challenge the party's authority. It knows, that is, the Communist Party knows that an independently wealthy class can be a threat to party rule. And of course, there are a number of reasons, and we don't have time to go into all the reasons for it, but clearly the newly wealthy entrepreneurial class, or the middle class, although some of my colleagues disagree that China has a new middle class, but if you look at this particular class, whether it's entrepreneurial or new middle class, it is interested in protecting its private property from arbitrary seizure. Now, we know that the Communist Party is not going out and seizing private property, but given the nature of the authoritarian political system, the possibility of that happening in the future cannot be discounted 100%. And that's why the new entrepreneurs or the new middle classes would like to see some guarantee for security of their private property. Secondly, as entrepreneurs, they also want to see greater transparency in policy making. Let me now turn to China's international role. Earlier this morning, Professor Wang Gungwu argued that China has, having gone through a debate, China is now in favor of a status quo in the international system. I unfortunately find myself not agreeing with Professor Wang Gungwu on this particular point, because I think China is neither a status quo nor a revisionist power. Its position on different parts of the international system depends on how each part affects its own interests and objectives. So, for example, on the reform of international financial institutions, it advocates significant changes to enhance its own position within those institutions. On the other hand, when it comes to the reform of the United Nations Security Council or the non-proliferation regime, it is generally in favor of maintaining the status quo. So, for example, China today is the only Asian power to be a permanent member of the Security Council. And there are other, particularly Japan and India, who would like to get a seat as permanent members of the Security Council, and China is unwilling to concede to the reform of the Security Council if it means that any of those two powers is going to share that status with China. If you look at foreign aid and investment, China, if you've been following the media reports, China has become a significant donor of development assistance. when it comes to foreign aid and investment, China seeks to promote its economic interests by linking investment and aid. In the process, it undermines the fledgling foreign aid regime that has been evolving under pressure from civil society groups in traditional donor countries. We know that traditional donor countries have not always been clean in the sense that they have also used foreign aid for economic purposes. But over the past 20 years, under pressure from civil society, a regime seems to be emerging. Although it is not in the same nature as, for example, the international financial regime, but a regime seems to be emerging where a decoupling of investment and aid has been emphasized. But China's foreign aid and investment policies tend to undermine that fledgling regime. Finally, we live in a world which is complexly interdependent. While China seeks to change some parts of the international economic order, it wants to maintain some other elements of the international system. The arrival of China on the world stage as a major economic power will change the world, but China itself will change in the process. It cannot remain unaffected by what happens in the rest of the world. The big question is whether political change in China will be affected by the Communist Party or it will be forced upon it. Thank you.
Thank you and good afternoon. Not only, as Professor Harper said in introducing me, do I work for an organisation that has a significant commercial presence in Asia in general and China in particular, but at the personal level, my wife and I have 2 children adopted from China, so at both levels take a particular interest in what's happening in that country. And of course, over the last 30 years, China's economic achievements have been truly astonishing. As I'm sure everyone's aware, more people have been lifted out of poverty more quickly over that time than at any other in human history. China is now rightly regarded as a major participant in the global economy and is quite legitimately seeking a role commensurate with that in forms of international governance, not least in terms of economic and financial governance. Yet, over the past decade, I'd argue that 2 aspects in particular of China's economic growth and transformation have become increasingly problematic. First, its double-digit growth over the years 2003 through 2007, peaking in mid-2007 at a rate of 14%, were unstable, imbalanced, uncoordinated and unsustainable. Who said that? Not me, but Premier Wen Jiabao, speaking in 16th of March 2007 to the State Council. And he was right. China had become characterised during this period by a number of bubbles, particularly in its property and stock markets, which were in turn fuelled by the monetary policy settings that China was forced to follow as a result of the combination of large and growing current account surpluses and an unwillingness to countenance either offsetting private capital outflows or an appreciation of its currency against those of its principal trading partners. And as a result, within China itself, there were distortions and bubbles that, in their own way, were as potentially damaging for the Chinese economy as the bubbles which had grown up within the United States and British economies in their respective property and stock markets. The second aspect of this is that China had unintentionally, I'll grant you, contributed to the growing instability in the global economy. Its massive external surpluses were, in their own way, as much a part of the instability in the global economy, the consequences of which we've witnessed over the last 18 months, as the corresponding large deficits being run by the United States and other countries. China contributed directly to the excessively easy global financial market environment, which, along with inappropriately loose monetary policies in the United States far beyond the justification for them, contributed to the emergence of the asset price bubble in the United States, of which the subprime mortgage market was a part. And there's no better direct evidence for that than the fact that the Chinese central bank itself had, by the middle of last year, accumulated nearly $400 billion in bonds issued by the two US mortgage insurance agencies, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. And China has, through that, contributed to a major policy problem for itself, namely that it now has some $2 trillion worth of foreign exchange reserves which are overwhelmingly denominated in US dollars, and is thus, perhaps more than any other single agency in the world, vulnerable to the possibility of a significant fall in the US dollar. Yet China itself, in worrying about that risk and in contemplating actions supposedly designed to minimise that risk to itself, is in grave danger of precipitating what it fears, that is, a run on the US dollar if it were now to take the kind of action to protect itself against that risk by reducing its holdings of US dollars. Moreover, the bursting of China's own property and share market bubbles in the first half of last year, that is before the onset of the most severe phase of the global financial crisis, has had more to do with the subsequent slowing of the Chinese economy than has the decline in China's exports that really only began in November last year after the collapse of Lehman Brothers. That said, so far China has had what could be called a good crisis in four respects. First, it has made what are uniformly regarded as bold policy responses to the downturn in its own economy. There are a few other countries which have gone as far as China has in terms of marshalling fiscal policy in particular in order to address the economic downturn within its own borders. Secondly, it's evident in China to a much greater extent than in any other major economy that the measures it's taken, both fiscal and monetary policy, to put a floor under the downturn in its economy have been effective. There are few economies in the world that can make a reasonable claim that their economies will be growing at something like their sustainable trend pace before the year is out than China. Third, China has emerged as playing a constructive role in international coordination of global responses to the crisis. For example, by eschewing for the most part protectionist measures, although in that context I note with some concern the announcement over the last few days of what appear to be significant preferences for domestic firms in government procurement, which of course just understands the futility of some of our own state governments seeking to do the same thing. I include under that heading of playing a constructive role in international negotiations about the crisis the proposals that have been put forward earlier this year by the Governor of the People's Bank of China, Governor Zhao, for a new system of international reserve management. That's not to say that I endorse the particular specifics of China's proposal to use the SDR, the IMF's special drawing right, as a new international currency, or for the IMF all of a sudden to become some kind of global bank issuing that currency, but rather the fact that China has been prepared to come forward with well thought out proposals as a contribution to what is undoubtedly an important medium-term global issue, reflect well on the way the authorities in China have responded to that. And finally, and perhaps again not necessarily intentionally, China has been a major indirect beneficiary of the damage that the global financial crisis has done to the international reputation of the so-called Washington Consensus, the idea that, for the most part, market forces, unfettered to any significant degree by government regulation, should be the major driver of and determinant of patterns of economic growth in individual countries and around the world. Instead, China's, if it can be called Beijing consensus of essentially state-directed economic growth, with state-owned enterprises playing a major role in key industries and with government continuing to exercise tight control over financial sector activities in particular, at the moment does appear to many elsewhere in the world as being a more desirable outcome. Now, I don't necessarily endorse that conclusion myself, and I'm not advocating it. What I'm simply saying is that as a result of the collateral damage that the US model of economic activity, or the Anglo-Saxon model of economic governance, has sustained, China's standing with the rest of the world has been commensurately enhanced. Yet China cannot, in my view, seek to return to the status quo ante in the international economic order. That is, simply to restore the world to where it was before the onset of the financial crisis. The rest of the world, and in particular the United States, won't long tolerate what they see as, rightly or wrongly, China's mercantilist trade policy as being the primary way in which they interact with the rest of the world. The rest of the world isn't going to tolerate, and nor, I would argue, is it in China's interests for it to resume its running of what I've sometimes described as the greatest vendor financing scheme the world has ever known. That is, the arrangements whereby, in effect, prior to the onset of the crisis, China lent to Americans the money that Americans needed to keep borrowing so that they could keep buying the goods which China needed to keep exporting to them so that China could in turn sustain its model of primarily export-led growth. Just as the US saves too little and spends too much and needs to reverse that, China does the reverse, saving too much and spending too little. Much of the excess saving undertaken within the Chinese economy is not in the aggregate by households, although Chinese households do save a very high 40% of their disposable income. Household income, in turn, is actually quite a small share, not only by European or American standards, but even by the standards of other Asian nations, share of China's overall national income. Rather, the excess savings from the perspective of China's economy as a whole are, for the most part, in the corporate sector, and in particular, these days, within the state-owned enterprises sector. And it's that excess savings which Chinese SOEs are allowed largely to keep for themselves, free of any market discipline, or indeed even any policy discipline exercised by China's economic ministries over how it's allocated, that in turn lies behind the excess investment that is another key characteristic of the Chinese economy, by contrast not only with Western economies but also with most other Asian economies at similar stages of their economic development. Fortunately, and I say this from China's perspective as much as from that of any external observer, there is a neat solution to these imbalances that persist within China's economy, and that is for the Chinese government to introduce dividend requirements on its state-owned enterprises, that is, requiring them to transfer to the Chinese state as the owner of these enterprises a significant proportion of their profits, which would in turn allow the Chinese state to fund a more adequate social security system that would in turn reduce the need for Chinese households and families to save as much of their incomes as they do and allow them to spend more. At the same time, imposing a dividend requirement on China's state-owned enterprises would oblige them to submit to the discipline of either the stock market, the bond market, or a more commercially oriented banking system in allocating the capital for investment, and hence inevitably resulting in slightly less of that. A likely consequence also would be that China would run smaller external surpluses and desirably would allow more of those surpluses to be offset by capital outflow, that is, allowing ordinary Chinese citizens and Chinese institutions to invest in other parts of the world, an option that's currently denied to them. And all of that would, in my view, not only be in the interests of the international economy broadly defined, but would also be very much in China's own interests. And since, as a major power in its own right, the Chinese, no less than any other country of similar standing, can be expected to decide what they do primarily by reference to what's in their own interests. It's my hope that Chinese economic policy over the next 5 to 10 years is going to go down that particular path, in which case not only will the world be a more stable place economically, but Chinese people will also enjoy the better living conditions to which their own efforts very much entitle them.